Welcome to the first semester of Human Anatomy and Physiology with Dr. Jason Laughlin, a course that considers the basic principles of human biology, including the chemistry important for biology, cytology, biological energetics, cellular reproduction, DNA, tissues, bones, and muscles. If you have a question for Dr. Laughlin, be sure to post it on the course discussion board. Now, here's Dr. Laughlin.
Well, welcome to the first lecture. Let's go ahead and talk about Chapter 1 in your textbook. This is just an introduction to the human body. This first exam material that we're going to be going over in a few weeks, or which will be tested over in a few weeks, will be Chapter 1 and Chapter 2. Chapter 1 is just an introduction to the human body in terms of basic anatomical terms, various sections through the body, how we organize the body. We'll talk about various membranes, and we'll talk about properties of life and things like that. And Chapter 2 deals with chemistry. And the first test will actually be over those two chapters. So let's go ahead and get started with this particular chapter, Chapter 1, Intro to the Human Body. So this is the first semester of a two-semester course, and the first thing that we want to talk about is some basic definitions. And so we'll start off with the general term of what exactly is anatomy. What are we studying? And we'll talk about anatomy. So as the slide said here, the anatomy is just the study of the internal and external structure and the physical relationship between body parts. And I have structure italicized there because another definition that we could think about is just the study of the structure of the human body. Okay, so anytime you see anatomy, we're dealing basically with structure. Okay, the other part of this course is physiology. And a basic definition for physiology is the study of how living organisms perform their function. Okay, and function is the key word here. Another definition for physiology is just the study of the function of the body. So function as opposed to structure. Anatomy and physiology are typically taught together because they do work very well together for a whole lot of reasons. In some classes, certainly when you get into your upper level courses, they will start to split them up. Sometimes you'll take a human physiology course or a cardiac physiology or nephron physiology, specific courses that are higher level. But for now, the good place to start is to talk about the anatomy and talk about the physiology together because they work so well together. The one big key feature that we see that underlines all of biology, whether it be anatomy and physiology or ecology, is that structure determines function. So the structure of an organ, or the structure of a tissue, or the structure of an apparatus in an organ, that structure determines how that part functions. Okay? And there's a principle, what's known as the principle of complementarity of structure and function, which your book basically talks a little bit about. But basically what this is suggesting is that the structure of, say, a nephron in the kidney. A nephron is what filters, it filters blood in a way, and then it tries to reabsorb a lot of the things that are lost. And when we look at the structure of the nephron, it gives us a whole lot of insight about the physiology. So if you didn't know anything about the physiology, and you know a little bit about the anatomy of a nephron, you could pretty much figure out how it works. And that's exactly how we do it. I said earlier that these two courses, anatomy and physiology, are typically taught together, and the beauty in that is that in order to understand the physiology of something, you have to understand the anatomy. And this structure determines function concept, this principle of complementarity and structure and function underscores that, okay? To understand the physiology of something, you have to understand the anatomy. So they're taught very well together because of the fact that when we talk about the anatomy, we can also talk immediately about the physiology. So a good key principle of biology in general is that when you look at the structure of something, the structure determines the function. Well, when we talk about different levels of studying of anatomy, there's different ways to study anatomy. Of course, there's this thing called gross anatomy, also known as macroscopic anatomy. And when we talk about gross anatomy, we're talking about looking at studying anatomy without using a microscope. So we don't need a microscope to study gross anatomy. So things like, here we have the respiratory tract that's highlighted, so we can see lungs, we can see the trachea, we can see the larynx. So that's very gross anatomy stuff. When we look at the digestive system in this particular slide, we can see the stomach, we can see the intestinal tract, small intestine, large intestine, we can see liver, we can see esophagus. We can see those things at a gross level, right? At the macroscopic level. So that's one way to study it. In fact, in lab, that's the only way we're really going to be dealing with lab. Well, for the most part, we will do a little bit of non-gross anatomy stuff in the second test, but for the most part in A&P 1 and 2, we really focus on gross anatomy. The other approach would be microscopic anatomy. Okay, so microscopic anatomy, of course, we need a microscope because the structures that we're looking at are way too small. So here's a section of tissue through the trachea. So this is right here where the X is. This is, whoops. Now let me just start over here. This area is called the lumen. Okay, that's the opening area where the trachea is. That's where the air moves. And you can see here that this particular set of tissue, you need a microscope to see that. We can see little structures on those cells called cilia. Let me change my color. Well, that didn't work, did it? So you see little hair-like structures at the end of those cells called cilia, which we'll talk a lot about in chapter 3. But those cilia, you can't see those cilia without a microscope. And those tell us a lot about the function of the trachea. We see all kinds of the characteristics of these cells, gives us a whole lot of insight. We can see the structure of that layer of cells. And of course, to see those things, you really need a microscope. When we look at the cross-section of let's see, this looks like an esophagus, where here's the lumen, so that's where food moves. That's always, the lumen's the opening. And then you can see the tissues and the cells that surround that opening. So looking at microscopic anatomy, you have to have a microscope. You can't do it without a microscope. Okay, so there's different levels of study in terms of how we look at anatomy. There's also different approaches of studying anatomy and physiology. And the one that we're going to use, and the one that you always start off with, is called systemic. The systemic approach, or also known as systemic anatomy. And in this particular approach, what you do is you look at one system at a time, one organ system at a time, and you consider that entire organ system over the entire body. So for example, when we talk about the skeletal system, we'll talk about the skeletal system in the head, we'll talk about it in the torso, we'll talk about it in the arms and in the legs, we'll talk about it everywhere. And then we'll move on to the next system, which will be the muscles. And we'll talk about the muscles everywhere. Then we'll talk about the nervous system. Then we'll talk about the cardiovascular system. We do one system at a time, and we look at it all over the entire body. So it's a systemic approach where you're looking at one system at a time. The other approach that you will run into later in your studies of if you go into higher levels of anatomy or physiology is you'll look at what's known as the regional approach. And in the regional approach, this approach assumes that you've already had it at the systemic approach. So the systemic approach, this is kind of the introductory level. Okay, that's where we're going to start. This will be higher level of study. So, dental hygiene, for example. If you're dental hygiene, you'll be looking at not only the teeth, but you'll be looking at the nerve and the nerve endings. You'll be looking at various tissues. You'll be looking at endocrine structures, and you'll be looking at different systems in that particular region. So in the regional approach, you take one region of the body, say the head, and you look at all of the systems in that region and how they interact together. Then you move to the next region, then you move to the next region, and you consider organ systems in those regions all together. Okay, so the systemic approach is where we start, and that's what we'll be focusing on in the rest of this entire first and second semester, going one system at a time. Now, one of the big things that this is in the biology department. This course is offered in the biology department. And one of the things that we have a difficult time doing is coming up with a definition of what it is that we actually study. So, of course, biology studies life, but what exactly is life? That's the big question. And if you went and you sort of cornered 100 biologists and put them in the corner and you asked them to define life, to give you a specific definition, and in fact, if you have your textbooks open, if you will turn to the back of your really, really expensive textbook and you look for the definition of this term called life, You won't find it. It's not in any of the big biology textbooks. It's not in your anatomy and physiology textbook. Yet this is exactly what we study. We study life. And so if you asked several biologists to define it, it would be very difficult for them to do. No one would agree on it. So what we can do, though, is come up with some characteristics that all living things share in order to actually be considered alive. Okay, so characteristics of life. We can't come up with a nice concrete definition, but we can come up with some characteristics that all living things share. And the first one is all living organisms, no matter how small or how large, they're all composed of cells. So they have a cellular composition. Okay, everything is composed of cells if it's truly alive. In those cells, we also have the genetic material, and that genetic material in terms of living organisms is always DNA. Okay, DNA is deoxyribonucleic acid. That's the D, N, and A. Okay, so deoxyribonucleic acid, we'll talk a lot about DNA in the upcoming chapters, but every living organism, every living cell in your body and in every other organism has DNA. Okay, plants, fungi, protists, bacteria, they all have DNA. Another feature that all living things share is metabolism. We all have a type of metabolism, and every single cell does metabolism. So metabolism, a nice quick definition of metabolism would just be the intake and expenditure of energy. Okay, the intake and expenditure of energy. Okay, so metabolism, you're bringing things in, you're bringing energy in, you're spending that energy. That's called metabolism. Everything has metabolism. Next one is growth. Everything that we know of that's alive grows. It gets bigger in terms of either the cell gets bigger or it divides by various mechanisms of division to produce a bigger organism. So all living things grow, and of course they eventually grow and eventually die. So kind of death comes into growth as well. Responsiveness is another thing. Now responsiveness, what we're talking about here is we mean that they respond to a stimulus. Every living thing has to be able to respond to a stimulus. In this particular description, there's two kinds of responsiveness. The first one is called adaptability. Okay, adaptability. This is responding to long-term stimulations, long-term changes. So, for example, many mammals will grow a heavy coat during the winter, or you look at migration patterns in birds and butterflies. Mammals, you look at the migration patterns. Those are adaptable responses, right? They're based on seasonal changes that are very, very predictive, and they're adaptable. They've adapted to those particular changes, so they're long-term changes. The other type of responsiveness is much more short-term, and that's called irritability. So irritability means that you respond to a very short-term stimulus. So if you put your hand on a hot stove, you didn't know it was hot. We have reflexes that immediately pull your hand away before tissue damage is done, or at least too much tissue damage is done. So short-term changes, those are irritability types of responses. Okay, reproduction. Next characteristic. All living things have to reproduce, otherwise that species wouldn't be around anymore. So reproduction is a big one. Movement is another one. All living things move at some point. And this particular one, you think of movement like external movement, like me walking across a room or you writing something down. That's not necessarily the type of movement that I'm referring to, but movement in this case, we're talking about moving things intracellularly, inside of a cell. They're moving things around. Plants do that. Everything does that. Okay, so obviously plants don't have muscles and they don't move necessarily. So that's not what we're talking about. We're talking mainly about intracellular movement of things called organelles and liquids and things like that. And then the last thing that all living things share or have in common is this term called homeostasis. And we'll talk much more about homeostasis in the next part of this particular lecture, this chapter 1. because that's going to be a really key mechanism that everything has, and we're going to be talking a lot about homeostasis over the next 2 semesters. So we'll come back to homeostasis, and we'll give you a much better definition than I have at this particular time. Okay, well, it turns out that organisms are also structured, especially multicellular organisms. And so when we look at how organisms are structured, there's a specific hierarchy. So this particular image from your book, I lost my pen, starts at the very most fundamental level of organization, and that's the atomic level right here. So the first level is actually not called atomic level, but it's really called the chemical level. So there's the chemical level of organization. And in the chemical level, we're talking about atoms. And atoms all have very specific structures. And those specific atoms come together with other atoms to form compounds and molecules, as you see right there. And then those compounds and molecules eventually build the next level of organization. So the first most fundamental level is the chemical level. That's where we're all composed of atoms and molecules and compounds. Now, when those molecules and compounds come together, they form the next level of organization called organelles. Okay, organelles. Now, organelles, the organelle level, when you look at that term organelle, everybody knows what the term organ means. We have a kind of a basic understanding of what an organ is, but if you put ELL at the end, that means little organ. So a little organ would be something that you find inside of a cell that has a specific function, like this organelle that they're showing here called a mitochondrion, or you think of the nucleus, or you think of the Golgi complex, or you think of ribosomes. Those specific organelles inside of cells have very, very specific functions. And they are all based on the molecular and the compound structures that atoms give rise to. So the chemical levels first, organelle levels next, then your textbook jumps to the cellular level. So cells, this is the very first level of organization where we say, hey, this cell is actually alive. They are the smallest living units of an organism. Okay, if we're talking about multicellular organisms, they are the smallest living unit in an organism. And for many organisms, that's as far as we go. We don't go any higher than that in our organization level. The cellular level is it. If you're a unicellular organism like a bacterium, that's as far as you go. But if you're multicellular, like many plants and many animals, then you go to the next level, which is the tissue level. Okay, so tissues are composed of similar cells that work together. They have the same function. So they're similar types of cells that have the same general function. So here we're looking at, in this particular image, we're looking at smooth muscle tissue. Okay, so it's got lots of different cells. They're very similar in structure, and they're all working together for the same function. The next level of organization is here, the organ level. So when you put different types of tissues together and that basically have the same overall function, you get this thing called an organ. So here we're looking at a blood vessel. Notice it has connective tissue, it has muscle tissue, it has blood, which is actually a tissue in there. And so this makes up the organ called, in this case, a blood vessel. So organs are composed of different types of tissues that have the same general function. The next level of organization in many multicellular organisms is going to be this one, the organ system level. So the organ systems, in this case, we just keep going in terms of our definitions here. The organ system is going to be organs that interact to different organs that interact to provide a same common function. Okay, so you think of the muscular system. So the muscular system is composed of different organs, different tissues, different types of cells, different types of organelles, different types of molecules and compounds to give rise to the same common function. Okay, they provide the same common function. And finally, when you get many, many organ systems put together, you finally get up to the organism, where we finally have a person in this case, or you finally have a frog, or you finally have a snake, or you finally have a plant. The organism level is based on all these previous organization levels. Okay, talk a little bit about the anatomical position, what's called the anatomical position. We need to talk a little bit about the language of anatomy and understand that early anatomists, when we talk about this, early anatomists had a real problem in communicating various directions and various body parts of where things are located. You can ignore all of the lines and the colors on this particular sketch. This is just to show you what's known as the anatomical position. Okay, so the anatomical position is this position that anatomists all decided on, that this would be the standard position when we talk about describing this compared to that. And so what it is, it refers to a person standing straight up like this with their face directed forward, their upper limbs are hanging to the sides, and the palms of the hands are facing forward. Okay, so this is called the anatomical position. Anytime you refer to body parts being superior to that or inferior to that, or posterior and superior or inferior, start over. Superior, posterior, inferior, anterior, lateral, whatever the directional term is, you always are talking about that person being in the anatomical position. It's a very important position that's critical that you understand. Well, when we look at some common anatomical terminology, this particular slide, notice the person is standing in the anatomical position. But what you need to know for the first test, for sure, is these particular terms. Instead of calling it the elbow, it's called the antebrachial. That's actually the forearm. The wrist is the carpals. The ankle is the tarsals. Okay, and the knee is patellar. Sometimes you'll see popliteal. But for this first test, I want you to be able to certainly match up these body parts with the correct anatomical name. And there's also an image that shows the posterior side as well. So make sure that I know that this image is in your textbook. Make sure you're familiar with it. It'll be a matching question or two on your first test. The other thing that we need to talk a little bit about in terms of getting oriented with the human body is directional terms. And there's a nice set of tables in your book that deal with this, but superior and inferior, when we take these top two here, superior and inferior, also known as cranial or caudal. Caudal means tail. Superior, of course, as this arrow indicates, is up, and this one's down. So if we talk about, the eyebrow being superior to the eye, that means that the eyebrow is above the eye. If you talk about the eyeball being inferior to the eyebrow, then that of course means it's below. So there's inferior, there's superior. There's also ventral and dorsal. These are two different terms. Dorsal means towards the back, also known as posterior, and ventral means towards the front. Guess I need to erase all of these. Got to be a better way to erase that. Let's see, what's next? Okay, there's also medial and lateral. I'm not so sure about this intermediate. Let's just not even worry really about the intermediate. It's okay, but you can really do all of the descriptions with this term here, medial versus lateral. Medial means towards the midline of the body. So your sternum and let's say your sternum or your backbone, those are very medial structures. They're right down the middle. And lateral means away from the midline. Okay, so these are all very relative terms. Your shoulder, for example, would be lateral to your sternum, to the midline of your torso. And your sternum, of course, would be medial to your shoulder. All right, so these are very descriptive terms. They are relative terms, relative terminology. I'm going to have to learn how to erase this a little bit faster. All right, let's look at, I think there's one more table here. Yes, proximal, distal, superficial, and deep. Proximal and distal refer to joints. So, and the joints are going to be mainly the shoulder and the hips. Okay? And so when you talk about something being proximal or distal, you're really referring to those joints. So your elbow, if you look at your elbow, if you're in the anatomical position, your elbow is what to your wrist? What would your elbow be to your wrist? Well, your elbow is closer to your shoulder. So your elbow would be proximal to your wrist because your elbow is closer to your shoulder than it is than your wrist is, right? So it's proximal. The other flip side of that would be that your wrist is distal to your elbow, right? It's distal. It's further away from that joint. Okay, same thing applies to the hips. There's also superficial and deep, sometimes called external and internal. This refers to going deep into the tissue. So the skin is the most superficial structure we actually have. And underneath the skin, there's a hypodermis. So that's just one level deep to the superficial skin. Now, if you go really further, much deeper, then you get into the bones. So there's bones, and then on top of that, there's muscles, and on top of that, there's nerves, and then on top of that, there's skin. Okay, so if we look and we think about, well, where are bones located compared to, or let's back up. Where are muscles located? Where are muscles located to bones? Well, you would say muscles are superior to bones because they're on top of it. They're on top of the bones. But you'd also say muscles are deep compared to the skin. All right, so these are, again, relative terms. You have to say it's this to that to make any sense of it. But the most superficial structure, of course, is the skin. The bones are the deepest. Okay. What else are we going to do? Let's do one more thing here, planes of division, before we take a break. Planes of division, it's really important that you look at planes of division and understand what you're looking at when you do that, because we're talking here about how you make a cut. Okay, and there's 3 ways to do this. And this particular image over here shows exactly what we're talking about. And they have these clear slices through this person to show you different planes. But the first plane that we're talking about is the frontal plane. Okay, the frontal plane, you'll notice here, divides the body into anterior and posterior halves. So if you make a cut that's a frontal section, then you're going to separate anterior from posterior. And so when you look at this scan right here, this is what's called a frontal scan or a frontal image, where you basically have ripped off the front of the torso, and we're looking just deep to that. Okay, so this is a frontal section. You remove that frontal part. Another one is, let's see, this is a transverse section, sometimes called a cross section. The old term is a cross section, and that's because you're cutting across the longitudinal axis. The longitudinal axis of this individual is right here, and you're cutting across it, so that's called a cross section or a transverse section. And when you look at this kind of section, it's going to give you a very different image. They actually, here's the picture of a cross section through the abdomen, so it's going to give you a very different view. Here's the spinal cord. Okay, here's the spleen. There's the liver. It's going to give you a very different view compared to a frontal section. And so it's really important to know, well, what am I looking at? What kind of section is this? This particular one is a cross section or a frontal section. And then finally, a plane of division. The last one is called a sagittal section. They call it a medial section here. I don't like that, but let's go with sagittal. Okay, sagittal sections. A sagittal section divides the body into right and left halves. Okay, right and left halves. So if you take a section right down the middle of your face and you cut your face, or your head basically, into right and left halves, that's called a sagittal section. Now, sagittal sections come in 2 types. There's called what's known as a parasagittal, and then there's a mid-sagittal. Okay, and the parasagittal section is going to be one where it is a sagittal cut, but it's going to produce unequal right and left halves. So unequal. Whereas a mid-sagittal is going to give you equal right and left halves. And there's only one cut that you can do that's going to give you a perfect mid-sagittal section. That's going to be right down between your eyes, right down the middle of your nose. That would give you a mid-sagittal section. But anything else, it's not going to be an equal section, right? So if you cut if you cut your ear off, that's going to be a parasagittal section because it's in that same plane, but it's not going to give you an equal right and left half.